Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be going over the San Antonio regional results. This was in almost 2,000 player regional championships. The Pokemon TCG continues to skyrocket in popularity for the competitive scene. Really love to see it, and it means that we have a lot of data, a lot of decks, and a lot of discussion for today's video. We're going to start off with the day 1 and day 2 deck representation, and we have the 6 most popular decks in front of you here, with Charizard and Miraidon being pretty close to one another in terms of popularity. The 2 Lost Zone variants, if you lump them together and just say Comfey decks, actually end up being like the 3rd most popular archetype, and those seem to be like the bunch above the rests. So looking at, from a metagaming perspective, it's going to be Comfey engines, Miraidon and Charizard seem to be the top 3 in popularity in terms of like what you need to counter in the format. Those probably are going to continue to be some of the top performing decks. Tina's been doing well recently and also did okay this tournament. Lost Zone Box has found many different variations of success so far, obviously winning in Stuttgart with a Sablezard build, but also many Mirage Gate lists with a ton of different EX attacking options and sometimes super effective glasses and whatnot. So there's a lot of shenanigans going on with Comfey Colrus, but combine those together and I think you should expect around that sort of 15+% of both of those archetypes combined. And then we have Mew and Gardevoir. Gardevoir slipping a little bit in popularity in terms of that day 1 percentage, but it hasn't top cut in a couple of tournaments now over in Europe, so that kind of makes sense why it's sort of dipping, and it's still trying to figure out the best solution to Miraidon, which is really popular. As we can see, 2nd most popular in the day 1 field, and by quite some margin in terms of individual deck. That's quite a high profile, difficult matchup. Also, the Lost Zone engines aren't necessarily easy matchups, the Tina being the tougher of the 2 because they play Path Disruption as well, so the sort of end game can get a bit fuzzy for the Guardy players. It's also not as strong into the Rapid Strike archetypes, which are still around, although they didn't make the graphic. We'll see that they had a pretty good day 1 to day 2 conversion rate. Still seems to be that sort of under the radar deck that is doing pretty well. I would say the same thing for things like Block Snorlax, where it's never really making that day 1 graphic, but it's still certainly going to be an archetype that you should have in the back of your mind right now. So overall, there still are these challenges for Guardy, and it makes sense as to why it's reducing in play from being sort of among the top 3 in popularity to sort of dipping at this point. And Mew VMAX outside of the glaring Charizard headache, which as we've seen we can tech for with Judge Path Disruption, with Grabber and Luxray if you'd like, or we can go down the Aselgor Grass package if you really want to give yourself some counterbalance, some weakness that you can boast into them. Outside of the iffy Charizard, there's a lot of reason to still see Mew succeeding in the format. Moving on to the day 2 percentages then, and wow, look at this, a stark contrast from day 1 to day 2. Charizard profiting and basically munching up all the Miraidons that were popular day 1, having a much tougher time of things in day 2. So Charizard and Miraidon both being the most popular decks, it's pretty obvious to see which is strong into which matchup. So Miraidon is kind of overplayed right now for how strong it is overall in the metagame. Lost Tina also having a pretty good conversion, much better than Lost Box notably, so it's a lot less of a chaotic archetype, should be easier to pilot, and just has a more coherent strategy, and notably I think has a better time into Charizard than the majority of the like Lost Boxy builds, outside of maybe like a Tropius Glasses combo. So it makes sense as to why Tina is doing pretty well. Mew held pretty strong. Intel VMAX, like I said, the Rapid Strike deck, underplayed right now for how strong it is. It makes sense in that it's a risky deck to pilot because you're worried about Snorlax, you're worried about Mew, you're worried about Roaring Moon. These are like fringe decks, and ultimately you're good into the general field, so even though we don't see Rapid Strike making it all the way into top 8 all that frequently, I still think it's a really good points deck in the game right now. So if you're getting close to an invite, I really do think that Rapid Strike is going to be a good archetype to take to give you a good shot of making it into that day 2. Now, if you're more concerned about getting really high chunks of points, maybe it's not the best deck because you do put yourself in that matchup roulette a little bit. It's not the most consistent deck that you can see on the graphic in general, so there are reasons to not be playing this archetype, but I do still think it's pretty well placed in the metagame overall in terms of the very high profile popular archetypes in the game, especially if you consider that half of the Mews aren't even that bad of a matchup as long as you can Spiritomb the DTE players. With all that said and done, let's get into the deck list themselves, and we have a 5th Modern Era regional win for Azul. What a consistent and strong performer. certainly the best that NA has to offer, I think, in the game right now, and is coming back with Charizard, has previous success with Charizard Pidgeot, and is bringing the archetype back once more. Taking some inspiration from Robin Schultz's list a few weeks back, has chosen to go for Rotom V to end on an instant charge in the opening stages, so you can sit on a pretty nice hand size, rather than having the attacking threat of Entei or having Pidgeot that jumps back into the deck, and also choosing, interestingly enough, to drop Radiant Charizard, which is a pretty powerful attacker, of course, but I do think this is more of an indication that you're choosing to go second whenever you can with the archetype. You're trying to just leave a single prize Pokemon in the active position whenever you can, so you're naturally feeding them the single prize card, which means as you work towards the late game, it's going to be all about the Charizard EX anyway. Outside of these Pokemon choices, also a couple interesting item choices. The double Countercatcher alongside 3 Boss's Orders is a really heavy line of gusting, but I do think Countercatcher is obviously a great combination card with Iono, can be really strong in the mirror match, can be strong in so many situations, so that lines up pretty nicely. I do like the min-maxing of Level Ball Charmeleon, although playing Level Ball over Nest Ball makes the utility of Rotom probably slightly less, so it is a bit of a trade-off. Maybe a 1-1 split is ideal here, I'm not too sure to be honest, but having that banked Charmeleon is certainly a decent option, and it's just extra outs to get, you know, your Mew, your Jirachi, those sorts of Pokemon, so I can never really discredit that. It's choosing to play the Justified Gloves over the Defiance band, which is pretty interesting. Obviously has the Vitality band as well, which is kind of like the premium tool, I would say, of all the choices here, but Justified is a clear nod towards trying to win that mirror match, which makes a ton of sense because it was the most popular deck in the room, so definitely a justified choice. And then finally, the split of 3 stadiums rather than having just a heavy Lost City count. Still has one in here, which can be a headache for Lost Zone players, especially with how many single copy attackers they have in their deck list these days, as well as still being sometimes a headache for Gardevoir, but still has that extra bump of consistency with the Artisan, and has the Collapse Stadium, which I think is a really strong choice when you are choosing to have both Lumineon and Rotom in the deck list, so you can get rid of your Rotom after that early game instant charge and deny some easy prize cards. Ultimately, I think this is going to be the gold standard of Charizard going forward. Firstly, Azul's piloted this to great success twice now, and also the team has also done exceptionally well with the deck. As you can see, Grant Manley was also able to place top 4, Caleb with the top 32 placement, and Grant Shen also with a top 64 placement, so the list did well in the hands of very good players, admittedly, but overall a ton of success, a lot of good logic behind it, and also their team has just stuck with Charizard for a couple of events now, so they've got it to a really good spot in the metagame. Grant Hayes was able to make 2nd place with Giratina VSTAR, so another tournament where Giratina has shone and got very deep into the tournament. There are a few differences from Alberto Conti's list from a couple weeks back, choosing to switch up a bit of the switching outs actually in the deck list, rather than just having, I think it was just a pure 4 switch card, which Conti was using, having a bit more versatility in here, also having 1 Pokegear in the deck list, rather than just having a 2nd copy of the Iono, so it gives you a little bit of extra reach towards the Colress's experiment itself, and also flip-flopping Countercatcher and Boss's Orders around. I think those are the big changes, and I think just cutting into one of the Nest Balls, which is sometimes relatively common anyway in the deck, but yeah, still taking that big inspiration, still has a lot of elements here that we have seen success with from Alberto in recent weeks, and again is another fantastic result for Giratina, which seems to be pretty well placed in the format right now, and isn't surprising me that it's going deep into these tournaments, because it does continue to be a really well-rounded choice. Palkia's bagged another top 8 placement after doing pretty well in Gdansk by Luke Kirkham, and now Joseph Nawal has been able to replicate the success with a few differences here, has cut away from the trekking shoes, has an extra copy of Earthen Vessel, has Energy Switch in the list, is playing a 2-1 count of the Ice Rider as well, so you can develop 2 of them and not just get pushed out the game from an early Boss's Orders kind of play into the Miraidon matchup. So a few tweaks here, I think they're pretty reasonable overall, and once again just proving that this is a real archetype in the game, can be a pretty consistent performer, is good against the majority of the field. Based on Joseph's matchups, I think Charizard EX is the most high-profile difficult matchup. I believe they went 2-2 on the day against it. So that's the only headache for me, that still Palkia has to be concerned with what is probably going to continue to be one of the more popular decks in the room, so that's something that you have to keep in mind. But at the end of the day, people are playing Mew and there's the same issues, so it's not too different really. Congrats to Grant on having another great placement in top 4, but it's the same list as Azul, so we've already covered that. We have Kyle Connor, who was doing really well in the Swiss rounds actually with a Snorlax build. It's not too different from builds that we've seen in the past. It has incorporated a couple copies of League Headquarters in addition to the Temple of Sinnoh, whereas in many lists you just see Temple in here, so the HQ can be more annoying for early tempo decks like Miraidon and Roaring Moon and such, so this does make a little bit of sense, because you already have decent stadium control with the potential to Sydney spam and obviously Silene back stadium cards. You can choose the right one for the right situation and just make that the dominant stadium as the game progresses, so that seems like a pretty reasonable cut. It's not too different from previous successful lists of Snorlax, although we will be looking at other interesting builds of control in a moment. Daniel Hugo was also able to do well with another interesting take on the Giratina. This time it's playing the Spiritomb, respecting and predicting some Mew, I guess. Also, it's playing the Avery in here. This unlocks sometimes your Sableye or unlocks your Radiant Greninja at different instances. If I was going to be playing an Avery in the deck, I probably would want to play a third copy of Water to really make the Greninja live more often and put the opponent in more awkward situations. But I do understand the logic behind the Avery, and in general, when you already have Lost Mine, you can create these awkward situations for the opponent. Is once again going for the 2-1 split of the boss CC, which I like in this direction, and has just cut into one of the Path of the Peak, but still has 3 copies, which is still a really solid count. Nick Robinson was our highest placing Miraidon player, and having a very, very aggressive 60 in front of us here, where we are having a 16 Lightning Energy count, 1 double turbo energy. The beach courts, so no Path of the Peak whatsoever, just trying to get out the gate swing as quickly as possible, has stripped down the Flaffy line to just 1-1 and 1 Super Rod, and has the quad Peony plus 2 Mew EX in the deck list, so you can reduce your hand size, get some generators and this, that and the other, play those out, then restart to top up your hand size and carry on from there. Very aggressive shell of the deck, where we're trying to set that stall out early, get a Bravery Charm, Iron Hands rolling, or Bravery Charm on Miraidon or Raikou can also be good in multi-prize matchups. We've got the VIP pass in the deck list, so we can get an early Squawk plus Miraidon EX, or get a Mew EX established early before a Peony as well. It's been interesting to see the success of this one over this weekend, whereas previously it looked like the general consensus was more leaning towards Path of the Peak, Judge, Iono, Disruption as the more logical choice. I feel like this build has less well-rounded matchups in that your Charizard percentages really drop quite substantially, but the trade-off is incredible speed and the option to just push people off the board if they don't have good starts, so there is something to be said about that. We'll round out the top 8 then with Hale's take on Control, much different to the list that we've seen already from Calconna, in that it's playing Pidgeot X in the deck and playing substantially more one-of cards, specifically supporters, rather than the typical like just Rotom engine where you have multiple copies and Pokegears. Instead, because you have Candy Pidgeot, you can cherry pick the right supporter for the right situation. You also give yourself double turbo energy, which means you can attack. And most importantly, it means you can use Tempting Trap with Mawile in certain situations against Minior, or you can just simply knock out Minior with Lost City with a double turbo energy play plus Pidgeot EX. This could actually be a means of knocking out other Pokemon that could potentially get around Safeguard, and then Mimikyu can be more of a checkmate style card. We can tank with Pidgeot. We obviously have Cheryl in here. We have Dunsparce to get rid of the lightning weakness, so it can actually not be this huge liability. You can tank it up as well with this sort of stuff. This build certainly seems like it can be more proactive with its disruption, where it does have that Luxray Fang sniping to pressurize opponents into plays at times, which can be pretty interesting. Or you can just catch your opponent on a bad hand, and then suddenly you can do all sorts going on in the deck as well. It's much less passive and has a lot more lines of play available to it, so I do think this offers much more than just being like an overall list check to opponents based on how many outs they're choosing to have with a regular Blocklax build. The top 16 had another Snorlax Pidgeot, as well as a 9th place Intel Urshifu. It had another aggressive Peony-based Miraidon build, a decent number of Mew players in the top 16 as well, and another Paradox Lost Box, which is the best name we have for it right now. This build being very similar to Christian Hodas's list. I think the inclusion of Mew EX is very intelligent, actually, especially with Tina upticking. I think that's a good choice, but overall very similar to what we've seen previously. So yeah, that pretty much rounds out the San Antonio results. Huge regional championships, really fun watch as well. Some really good games, especially some of the top cut games were super interesting. Let me know your thoughts on the video and where the format goes, because we are still in this Paradox Rift format for definitely a handful of tournaments and definitely a few months remaining as well. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what the best decking format is right now as well. That's definitely up in the air, whereas previously the sort of consensus was it was going to be Miraidon, Charizard, Guardians, like that big three, and that seems to have kind of shifted a little bit, where the Lost Zone engine is creeping back into being among the top 3 or 4 decks, certainly. So I'll hear your thoughts on it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.